One group put Liverpool behind them and went on to become an icon for their time.
Oh, it was mad. You couldn't hear them at all. You just screamed and cried, and just everyone was standing up and screaming and waving their arms, and it was just mad. And you didn't hear one word they sang.
I remember looking at John Lennon and thinking, I like this guy, I want to be like him. He was a hero. He was so different, even though he wore the suit and the tie and that. He was different. He was sort of forging a new way ahead. Even the length of people's hair changed directly because of the Beatles.
Donald Newton worked in a music shop.
When the Beatles came along, I was a branch manager in Runcorn. And of course, the scene absolutely exploded. There was people queuing for records. 10 deep. I had 4 of us staff upstairs on a Saturday. And the records then were only 6 and 8pence. Everybody wanted to be a Beatle, so they were buying a Fender Stratocaster guitar. It had to be in salmon pink, so everybody wanted to be a Beatle. Beatlemania.
The Beatles helped give young audiences around the world a common identity and a new sense of freedom and release. Established politicians felt that even they could gain by appearing with the Beatles.
Now, Paul. Same goes for me. Thank you very much for giving us this Silver Heart. But I still think you should have given one to good old Mr. Wilson.
It's time to get down and get with it for one of the first teenage magazine programs, A Whole Scene Going.
Put your way if you choose. Go in search of the blues. But go now if you're going, 'cause we're showing a whole scene going on.
Puzzled at how to attract the young audience, broadcasters made earnest attempts to be less stuffy.
Because this is the first programme in a new series in a new year, we start by looking ahead.
It was a time of young, brash style. A new generation of designers overhauled the fashion business. Clothes were made from new materials and produced and distributed quickly, and they sold at prices everyone could afford.
It was almost like an injection of adrenaline. It was just quite amazing. It's almost like having, you know, when you see these films that are black and white and it suddenly becomes colour. I had the most superb mini dress. So it was exciting because, I mean, in the 50s, it was just shirt-wasters and sensible dresses, and all the women, you know, young girls' magazines were neat little white shoes and little cuffs, and you should wear gloves and hats, and it's just, you know, that you were basically young, old people.
For centuries, fashion has belonged to Paris. Today, after years of absolute power, these style dictators stand assailed from all sides by cheap pop instant fashion.
Well, I went because you told me I should go. I thought it was fantastic. It's all changed tremendously in that we used to be very interested in what very fashionable women are wearing, like the Duchess of Windsor, like Jacqueline Kennedy. All these women have been influenced by the younger ladies in the street who are wearing these sort of what I call kooky clothes.
With their new self-confidence and their greater mobility and independence, young people's attitudes grew more defiant. At his high school in France, it was the regulations on hair length that first turned Romain Goupil into a rebel.
We were stopped at the school entrance by a teacher who said, if you have hair like that, you can't come to school. We were all supposed to be like sheep, and that was the first tract we put out. We aren't sheep, and we won't be sheared.
Romain Goupil tried to show his own growing disillusion and political consciousness with a film that he and his friends made about themselves.
Faced with my radicalism, my parents tried to argue with me in political discussions. But the more they tried to be reasonable, the more I rebelled. This wasn't just true for me, but for my whole generation. Fortunately, at our age, our liveliness got us involved with other things. Going out on dates, to the cinema, into relationships with the girls we met in our political activities. Perhaps the best way to seduce a girl was to talk about Trotsky or the Russian Revolution.
The new generation had more time to ask questions. They'd stayed at school longer and more went to university. In America, the number going into higher education doubled between 1945 and 1965. In Japan, 100 colleges were built in the 1960s. In Britain, 22 new universities helped cater for an extra 1.5 million students.
My sister and I were the first kids in our family who went to university. And, you know, you find yourself in an environment where you question everything and you debate everything, and the idea that there was a simple authority which everybody should respect kind of died mid-gasp.
In America, the richest country in the world, many of the new students began to turn against the consumer society that they themselves had grown up with.
Parents want you to make money, go to school, have a nice job. I don't want to have a nice job. I'll do anything as long as I'm happy.
Too many people are too materialistic. They just after the money for it, not necessarily for a job that they're really interested in.
Anybody who doesn't have an ideal is never going to do anything or go any place, because how can you be satisfied? See, you're constantly changing all the time. You have to have something as a goal.
Oh, you'd like to be my father, you'd like to be my dad, and give me kisses when I'm good and spank me when I'm bad. But since I left my parents, I've forgotten how to bow. So when I've got something to say, sir, I'm gonna say it now.
The young had new heroes, and the people they admired most were those who'd managed to overthrow established regimes against the odds. Students turned the revolutionary leader, Che Guevara, into a cult figure.
I think that international influences had become very important to us. And of course, people travelled a great deal. We were perhaps the first generation who could travel in that kind of way. And so it was entirely usual to run into friends and people who became close friends, who were from the States or from France or from Germany. And we all got to know each other well, and we all shared in each other's interests and concerns. Not just about politics. There were strong interests in the new wave of movie making, in music. I think some musicians operated in effect as an underground press, some of them by expressing very, very simple messages.
Bob Dylan's protest songs were reaching a mass audience just as a new cause was emerging.
Oh, the times they are a-changing.
Opposition to America's involvement in Vietnam would unite the young almost everywhere and become a catalyst for wider change. Young men who'd been called up burnt their draft cards in defiance of the government. But with the war escalating, others felt so alienated and disconnected that they simply dropped out. They concluded that the old world couldn't be repaired and believed they could create an alternative one of their own.
Come on, people now, smile on your brother, everybody get together, try to love one another right now.
In 1967, the hippies were discovered by the media, and suddenly everyone knew about them. Their psychedelic drugs, their clothes, their vision of peace, love, and communal living.
We were anti-engine, anti-car, anti-pollution. We wanted clean water. We didn't want to eat animals. We were strictly non-violence, and I really like that, strictly non-violence thing.
Many hippies moved to the country, setting up their own communities where they hoped to live by the anti-materialist ideas they preached.
We were concentrating on a very colorful, loving version of what life can be if we work together and play together. And a lot of people went off and they became very raggedy because they really didn't know how to survive, and they didn't know how to grow carrots, and they didn't know how to, you know, dig latrines, and they didn't know how to create alternative schools, and they had to learn all that.
The hippies established a drug culture that could seem benign, but it could also be utterly destructive. In London, the American embassy in Grosvenor Square was besieged by demonstrators, including David Treisman.
There was, more than anything else, a sense of the injustice of it, and a sense of horror, perhaps at seeing the First War, where day by day you saw the most appalling atrocities come back through your evening news. Small children on fire, people being shot, prisoners just being shot in front of you. It would have been a pretty insensitive population of young people in this country which didn't react to it.
And the war inspired a wider power struggle between youth and authority, which continued throughout 1968. At some universities, students attacked professors who tacitly supported the war. At others, they challenged the curriculum and the teaching. At Essex, David Treisman and his student comrades took control and proclaimed a free university.
A university seems to me to have one fundamental point, and that is to have a dialogue, not to be just talked at, not just to be taught, not just to receive edicts from bureaucrats. It is to establish a dialogue and question the whole fundamental principles of a society, including its class basis, which no university has got to yet.
The real anger and distress about the Vietnam War meant that if speakers came to a university like Essex, who were deeply involved in biological and chemical warfare, students were going to protest, and that is indeed what the protest was about.
As 1968 went on, more universities fell to student control.
We have complete control, and we will keep it till Sunday so that we can use it for the purposes that we've announced.
In Paris, riot police were called into the Sorbonne to deal with a student demonstration. After a bitter clash, the police occupied the university. Angry students marched to the rescue, including the 18-year-old Romain Goupil.
It was an extraordinary display of solidarity. Between 6,000 and 10,000 students went to the Latin Quarter. We overturned cars. We put up barricades around the students. As has been done traditionally in Paris for a long, long time, we found ourselves behind the barricade shouting, "We shall not be moved." We learned a lot of lessons from the United States, from Germany and Italy, and we defended ourselves, which led to a really violent confrontation.
Eventually, the police withdrew, and the students took over France's most respected university. The courtyard was transformed into a festival of art, philosophy, and revolution, an open seminar in how the university and France could be reborn.
Everything that hadn't been said for years was coming out, and everything we wanted for the future. The most utopian speeches, the most far-fetched revolutionary ideas were going to see the light of day, a sort of huge talking.
On May the 13th, 300,000 Parisians turned out in support of the students. The communist trades unions led the way, raising student hopes that the workers might join them in a Marxist revolution.
What sparked off the general movement in France was, above all, the violence against the students, police violence. Basically, we workers can't stand that.
France was hit by a wave of strikes. All over the country, workers occupied their factories, demanding better pay and shorter hours. The rest of France joined in, virtually everyone from architects to farmers. It looked as if the students' protest might bring the radical changes they hoped for.
There was no petrol, no trains, no cars, no television. Nothing. Everyone was on strike, and there was a kind of giddy feeling that we'd all played a part in jamming the wheels of government.
But when students marched to an occupied factory to join forces with the workers, they didn't get the reception they expected.
We heard on the radio the students were on their way. So we locked all the gates.
The students begged to be let in, but the workers feared they'd destroy the factory.
After the strike was over, we'd have to go back to work to feed our families. We couldn't allow them to damage our machines. What would have happened then?
The interests of the workers and the radical students were too far apart. By the end of May, it was all over. Though the universities themselves were reformed, the wider revolution was not to be. Within a few years, the US withdrew from Vietnam, responding to opposition that had started with the young and then spread far wider. With the war over, the binding source of protest was gone. For those who wanted to fight them, there were new causes. Some were embroiled in a different kind of struggle for black identity and power. Hippie ideas lived on with the environmental movement. Others fought for women's rights and gay liberation. And as one generation merged into another, and the rebels of the 1960s became the parents of the 1970s, some lost their sense of outrage altogether. Nevertheless, a major shift had taken place. Young people's ideas had won out, permeating and transforming almost every part of society. In music, design and fashion, the young now set the style. In Britain, laws affecting divorce, abortion, homosexuality and obscenity were relaxed.
I'm with you, I can control myself.
In America and Western Europe, many of the old rules and conventions that had still inhibited people in the 1950s had been replaced by a new freedom and openness.
Well, a lot of it was the pop stars. John Lennon openly started living with Yoko Ono, didn't he? And things like that. And then you'd see people, like, read the papers, they were having children, and they were calling him a love child. So why? I mean, we called them the posh people. If the posh people can do it, why do our mums think that if you get pregnant, that it's wrong?
The days have gone when youngsters were seen and not heard.
A new generation of teenagers weaned on pop, pot and protest will be the first in British history with a voice at the seat of power. For today, young people can drink, gamble and marry before they're 21, and now at the age of 18, they can vote.
If the young had failed to shake up politics as fundamentally as some radicals had hoped, at least they'd now been acknowledged. Britain lowered the voting age in 1969, and within the next few years, France and Italy followed, bringing in millions of new voters.
How does you feel to vote now at 18?
Well, I suppose it's quite exciting, you know, for the first time.
In the tougher economic climate of the 1970s, idealism and energy were sapped by worries that hadn't been there in the 1960s.
But while Britain in 1976 will produce 5% more graduates than ever before, there will be 10% fewer jobs for them to go to.
Graduates and school leavers were less secure, more worried about jobs and the future. Nevertheless, they were moving into a world that had been transformed. The changes of the 60s would live on.
It always takes time. The Cultural Revolution was brought about by the baby boom. 1968 had immense consequences for France.
It took away the assumption that the sovereign knows what he's doing. I don't think anybody is confident to let the king have his way without questioning it anymore.
We weren't going to be satisfied with the world of the 50s, where there always seemed to be somebody who had more authority, was often older, certainly always told you what your place was. I don't think that people were prepared to live with that anymore, and that was a real change during the 60s, and that'll never be undone again.